But just with kind of the way people consume podcasts, no one's like sitting down in front of a radio listening to a podcast the way they might binge watch like Netflix. People are listening to these as they walk around campus or something, so kind of like 10, 20-minute chunks, up to like 30 minutes I think is good. Stuff I'll talk about today keeps in mind equipment that's either free or open source or at least budget friendly. I'll also talk a little bit about where to get your podcast hosted and published, also keeping in mind some of the free and low cost versions. Talking a little bit about music rights and how to make money from your podcast, or at least break even, which is probably the best we can hope for. And then I'll talk about just some other things that, after this talk or after this conference, if you want to know more and get in touch with other people, other resources for help, I'll go through some of those. So just briefly, who am I? My name is Kristin Torres. I'm a master's student here at Harvard in the Russian, Eastern European, and Central Asian Studies master's program. Oh, hi, Roderick. At first I thought that I wasn't going to have to introduce myself, but there's people I don't know here, which is exciting. So my background is in radio. I used to work at the NPR Arts Desk, St. Louis Public Radio. I've done some work for KQED in San Francisco. I used to produce the Eurasian Enigma podcast, which used to be the podcast from the Davis Center for Eurasian Studies here at Harvard. I no longer do that, but it's okay. Also, basically what I wanted to say is that a producer, which I said like I'm a former producer, it's like what does a producer do? Pretty much everything. So if you are going to be a podcaster, content creator, basically you'll probably have to do pretty much everything in the kind of like bigger world of like WNYC podcasts or Gimlet Media podcasts. There might be a lot of people who do one section of it, like maybe one person who does the reporting, one person who does the editing. But if you're kind of a one-man band or you have a host or something, a co-host, you might be like a two-people band. So if your podcast has any part of, or it's kind of journalistic or involves reporting, that'll involve reporting. But if not, it might not collect, or it might not include any of these things. So maybe you'll have to collect ambient sound or interview tape. Maybe you won't. It all depends on the kind of podcast you want to have. So that brings me to different types of formats. So if we are here, we've probably all heard podcasts before, so you probably have some favorites that you're even kind of wanting to emulate or take tips from. Basically, they tend to break down into 3 or 4 major types of formats. The first one that's I think the easiest to emulate if you are just starting out is like interview shows or conversational style shows. I included these first because they involve the least amount of editing. So if you are someone who's just interviewing another person, often we call those like two-ways. If you guys are articulate and you're on point, like you don't need to actually bother with a lot of audio editing software. Same goes for conversation style. I don't know if you've ever heard the podcast like Another Round. That's one of the more popular sort of conversational style podcasts where it's like two friends discussing a topic. And the only cons to these types of shows are you have to be pretty articulate and you have to be pretty interesting. Like if you're only going to be 1 or 2 people and not interviewing anybody, or it's just you and your friend. But at the same time, it does allow you some like ease of editing. This also includes solo podcasts, so that's like Hardcore History. I think Dan Carlin gave the keynote yesterday.
He will tomorrow.
Oh,
I'm live streaming it.
Oh, great. So Hardcore History is like a really successful history podcast. I know we had someone here from History of Science. So that might be a show you want to emulate. History of Rome is another like phenomenally successful podcast where it's literally just one person telling these histories, but they do it in a really engaging way. The guy who did History of Rome, he actually got a book deal and now has like a series of books that he turned in from his podcast. And he's not, even though a lot of us are graduate students, like he doesn't even have like a graduate degree. He's just a guy with a lot of research and interest. And then the other type is a mixed format where, you might borrow from any of these types. If you have an episode, one episode might look one way, another one might look a different way. The only con to this is that sometimes if you're trying to build an audience and they don't know what to expect, they might want to see some consistency. They might kind of want to know a little bit of what to expect. How am I doing on time? Okay. So overall, whatever kind of podcast format you choose, even if it's kind of a freestyle one, even if it's kind of a conversational one thing you want to keep in mind is to keep it at least semi-structured. Maybe the most basic thing about structure is time management. So I don't know how many people tell me, like, check out my podcast, and it's like an hour and 45 minutes long. It's like, no one is that interesting. Like, no topic, no person, no like buddy podcast is that interesting. I always say, just as like a recommendation, keep it to 20 or 30 minutes. There are longer podcasts, of course, but just with kind of the way people consume podcasts, no one's like sitting down in front of a radio listening to a podcast the way they might binge watch like Netflix. People are listening to these as they walk around campus or something, so kind of like 10, 20-minute chunks, up to like 30 minutes I think is good. But that's just my opinion. And then so here's just my little like rant is like, please don't talk over an hour, like no one wants to hear that. What kind of gear will you need? Oh, and by the way, I just wanted to say, like, I'm going really fast because I only have 30 minutes. So I'm trying to cover a lot of ground here, but of course, like I said, I'll be willing to like send my slides and share my contact info if you have any questions. So basically here, the gear that you'll need can either be as simple as your smartphone, or you can go a little bit more advanced, and I'll show you on some of the next slides a couple of options. I would say the absolute basic things that you need. I have audio editing software up there, but again, if you're doing just like straight up interview or conversational, maybe you don't want that or need that right now. So the most basic stuff is either a smartphone or a recording device and headphones, and I'll show you some of those. So here on the $12 to $25 range is like a lapel mic that you can plug into your iPhone. So if you're doing that yourself, or you have a friend who's also a co-host and they also have a smartphone, you can kind of do that together, record your audio separately. But I can't get into too much into technique right now. But there's also a nicer like $40 boom mic that would be really cool if your podcast involves going out into the city or into nature or something and getting sounds that go beyond just like talking in a studio or something. This $50 Blue Snowball mic, the podcast that I used to work on at Harvard, we used that for a while. So it's a good mid-range one. I know a lot of people who use those. We eventually upgraded to like recorders that are several $100s, but we did start with those. And the middle one, the price got cut off. It's $150. It's one of the more sort of like standard mid-range podcast recording tools are from Zoom. So I believe this is a Zoom H2, but there's also like a Zoom H4 and a Zoom H5. There's some of the kind of mid-tier ones that a lot of indie podcasters use. Headphones are pretty important, and I'll tell you in the next slide sort of why. I personally have these. They're the $50 ones that are on the screen. But you could also do something like a headphone/recorder hybrid with these little sort of like almost like video game playing headphones that people use. I've never used it that way, but I heard that you can actually use it that way. These ones in the middle are kind of like the industry standard ones, I bet. Okay, I thought maybe you would be wearing them. But like at all of the places I've ever worked, they use these headphones, and I don't think that like they're that great, but they're just like ubiquitous. The one reason I plug headphones is, you think see yourself sitting at a podcast kind of like setup where you're recording, like all it matters, right, is what you hear. But actually what you would be really surprised to see is once you listen back to your audio, whether it's on your phone or through a recorder, you're gonna hear a lot of like room tone. Like we would hear, if I was recording this right now, you would hear really loudly the hum of that lawnmower. And so if you go then record, you're talking with your friend or you're interviewing someone, and then you think it sounds fine to your naked ear, when you upload it, you'll actually find, oh, this sounds sort of terrible. So a lot of times when I was recording the podcast at Harvard, we would be listening to the headphones and recording, and then I would hear like a truck go by. So I would just say, hey, can you pause for a second? And then once the truck went by, we would continue our talking. But you only really hear it with headphones. The one caveat is I've tried it. If you're using an iPhone, like voice memos or something to record, it doesn't actually allow you to listen at the same time, which is really weird. So it only works if you're using like a Zoom or a Marantz. But if you're using your smartphone, you can't actually listen to it at the same time. So I'm gonna blitz over this just because I don't know how relevant it is to you. It is like a totally different topic that there's courses on this actually. But the next level is audio editing. So if you want to edit your podcast, if you want to take out certain, say you're having a conversation and you want to take out part of that conversation, you do need to edit that using audio editing software. It's really not super difficult for basic maneuvers. One free one that a lot of people use is Audacity. It's free per PC and Mac. I do think that this is really, really clunky. I don't like it just because it's really clunky. It doesn't have a lot of automatic features. Like I think if you want to raise the volume, like you have to like click 5 different things. But it is free, so that's the trade-off. If you have a Mac, I've heard really great things about GarageBand, and it comes free if you have a Mac. I think there's also an iPhone app. The one I always use, and a lot of the places I've worked, if they didn't have proprietary software, a lot of people used Adobe Audition. If you have the Adobe Creative Suite, you probably already have Adobe Audition. I think it's like actually, it looks a little scary, but it's really user-friendly. And if you're gonna do a show that has, if you're interested in like sound design or doing anything more complicated, musicians also use this too, is Reaper, which is a free-ish open source audio editing software. It works sort of on the honor system, like you get it free for 60 days and then you're supposed to pay like $60 or something. Because I'm being recorded, I will say pay the $60. The other thing to know is that you are going to need a place on the internet to actually host your files. And this is harder than it seems. Just because you would think, okay, I've got this audio file, I want to put it up on my website that I made through Wix or Squarespace or something. The thing is, you'll need to embed those audio files, so it means those files need to be hosted somewhere else on the internet. One of the places that people usually use are SoundCloud, but also there's so many of these places, like especially with the renaissance of podcasting, there's like 9 zillion things now. But SoundCloud is sort of like the most kind of ubiquitous one. You get 3 hours free. If your podcast is short, like I told you, it should be 20 to 30 minutes, you could actually get quite a bit out of this. Otherwise, if you want like unlimited, it's $12 a month. A lot of people use Libsyn, which is liberated syndication. A lot of like really small podcasts use this, and a lot of big podcasts use this. If you like Mark Maron and his podcast, he uses Libsyn. It's like $5 or like $50, let's see, 50 megabytes per month for $5. But then there's also, there's just so many of these, but I'm giving you just like a quick blitz of these. So one thing that always comes up is music. Like, hey, like I want to have like Beyonce be part of my, whatever, what is the song? Like, what is the name for a song that's like the theme song, I guess is what I'm thinking of? Yeah. So like I want to have Beyonce be part of my theme song or whatever. The short answer is like you basically cannot do this. There's all kinds of people who will tell you like it's Creative Commons, it's fair use, if it's an educational podcast, there are actually different rules, but they're all so complicated and contradictory, all you can really say is just assume that you can't use it. There is license-free music out there that you could, basically it's creators that put their content out online for you to use for free, but there's kind of like gatekeeper websites where you have to pay like $15 to use the website, that kind of thing. The other thing to say is that you could, because I'm being recorded, I won't say like you could do it, but I've heard a lot of times, especially if you're just a small podcaster, like the chances that anyone is going to find your work and then sue you. I think what would happen is like they send you a cease and desist, or I've actually heard of people being contacted and asked just to take off the music, and it's not like they get rounded up to sent to jail or anything. But yeah, so unfortunately, music, even though there's like a lot of cool songs that you'd like to use, there's really not a lot out there. You can make your own music if you're a musician, if you play guitar, if you play piano, if you sing, or if you have a friend who does that. I've heard a lot of people where their music comes from just a friend making music, or asking a friend to use one of their tracks. So how to make money, or more realistically, how to be able to pay for your podcast hosting. So the model, unfortunately, the thing is that podcasts are sort of inherently hard to monetize because people just sort of expect them for free. Like, it's almost as though it's a public good. I subscribe to tons and tons of podcasts. I've never paid for a single one, even though they're always like, support me on Patreon. And I'm like, sure, someday I'll do that, but I never do. So even though, like, as a podcast person myself, it's like so hard to get anyone to pay for your work. The larger podcasts that we are probably all familiar with that have sponsorships from like all of those mattress companies, and like MailChimp for some reason is like so into the podcast game. The way they get those sponsorships is that, they have these huge audiences, so they can go to advertisers and say, if you, put an ad on my podcast, you're going to reach all of these listeners. So for smaller podcasts, like the ones that maybe you guys will create, or educational podcasts, the chance that you'll be able to secure a sponsorship or advertising are pretty low, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen. One alternative to getting like advertisement revenue is perhaps like sponsorship from an academic department, an academic institution or research center, a grant, or if you have a podcast that's targeted to a local demographic, you can ask maybe like a local business. When I had a podcast for a while here through Harvard, it was sponsored through a research center here on campus. So sometimes when that funding goes away, maybe your podcast also goes away. But like there's other things that you can use, especially if you have like a really specific topic, like say, art history or of a certain period, or history of science or something. There's all kinds of ways to find places that might be potentially interested in underwriting your podcast. The other thing is crowdfunding, which is probably the more likely scenario for everyone. I think everyone is probably familiar now with like Kickstarter or Patreon. Patreon is sort of the kind of deal where you create content, you put it online, you promote it over Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and basically ask people like, hey, give me $5, give me $10. And that's usually just like, essentially it's donations. The other cool model that I've seen a lot, and actually a lot of real legit podcasts and production companies have used this model, is putting something on Kickstarter or GoFundMe, where you create 1 or 2 episodes of a podcast you ideally would like to create. You make it as good as you can, and then you kind of put it online in Kickstarter and say, hey, if you chip in $5, $10, $20, I'll be able to create a season of this podcast. Usually there's like a goal of $500 or $1,000 or something. I've seen this work a lot. It's something that if I wasn't a grad student and had more time, I would do myself. But I think it's like a really, really great way to sort of, it would be nice to have money and not just be doing podcasting as sort of a hobby. So if you kind of pitch an idea, and then if people like that idea, then you can actually make that product while you already have funding. So I mean, maybe you'll make like $5 to $10 an hour, but maybe, it's better than nothing. So just additional resources, because I only have 10 minutes left. There are actually a surprising amount of resources here in the Boston area if you are interested in podcasting. I'm not sponsored at all, but I can't say enough about the Podcast Garage. This is a place at 267 Western Avenue. It's a really incredible resource. They are just a 20-minute walk from Harvard Square, and it's accessible via public transportation. They host these monthly maker mingles where people who are interested either in starting a podcast or finding a producer, or maybe there's always people who like, oh, I have this idea, and they come to these maker mingles and they find someone who's like, I don't really have any ideas, but I want to create someone's podcast for them. And then they meet other people, network, and I've seen a lot of things get made that way. There's also musicians who come sometimes trying to promote their music, and they'll let you use their music for their podcast. Another group which is associated with the Podcast Garage is Smash Boston, and it's a group of women podcast creators. They host skill shares, they host tutorials and workshops. Like there was someone who recently did a workshop about like how to interview people over Skype. So like if you have a interview, like you want to interview some professor from like California or something for your neuroscience podcast or something, you can actually get in touch with that person and interview them for your podcast. You just have to know the techniques, but there's definitely workshops like that at Podcast Garage. Podcast Garage also has courses in interviewing, in audio editing, in all kinds of different audio editing platforms. They have courses for marketing and branding your podcast. They do cost money, anywhere I've seen them from like $60 to $250. But they do have scholarships. So if you apply for a scholarship, you have a chance to be able to take these courses for free. I'm currently taking a course using one of their scholarships in sound design, and it's like a really incredible 5-week program. So all I had to do was apply for the scholarship, and so yeah. They also have a fully equipped studio. So if you want to have a two-way conversation with someone, I think that's the studio right there. They also have engineers, so if you need an engineer to actually produce your show kind of for you or set up the recording, you can do all of that. It does cost money, and I'm not sure how much it all costs, but you can check out podcastgarage.org for their equipment rental rates and their studio rates. And then the other thing, I only have a couple minutes, is transom.org, and it's basically used by so many different people in radio, even people who work professionally, to get equipment reviews. There's a lot of how-tos of how to use different audio editing platforms, a lot of advanced techniques, and there's additional resources, essentially longer versions of what I'm saying today, like online. I actually saw like a whole series on how to get started in podcasting. And then I think this is the last thing. Oh no, 2 more slides. There's also some podcast competitions that are open to anyone with an idea who, you might be able to just pitch your podcast idea, and different organizations and kind of places will select you to either pitch it or pilot it, and then eventually some of them get funded. There's been so many just this past year. There was one through Spotify. There was one through Gimlet Media. Google also just announced one, but I forgot the name of it and I couldn't find it, but I'm sure you can find it. They are open to both experienced podcasters and people who just have an idea. There is also the PRX Public Radio Exchange, which I can't describe right now because it's like so much. But just go to prx.org for more information. Basically, they help with distribution. Basically, they also help different like radio stations and shows such as This American Life will sometimes sort of scan PRX for content. So if you've put something on PRX and it gets picked up by a radio station or This American Life or something, a lot of times people get their stuff picked up from there, and you also get royalties every time it's aired. So that's a way to get money. And the last thing is, you can't really see my email address, but you can get in touch with me if you'd like. My email address is kstorres@g.harvard.edu. I'm losing my voice. And my Facebook, I'm always happy to talk on Messenger or friend you or whatever you'd like. On Facebook, I'm KS Torres. And I also do freelance like audio editing and training on equipment, but I don't want to like plug myself too much. But anyways, perfect timing with 4 minutes to spare. So if you want my slides, you can sign this little thing. But thank you. Does anyone have a question?
I do want to say something, maybe not a question, but I run into people that started out with Audacity, and like you said, it's a little more clunky.
Yeah.
The thing is, if you start cheap with something like that, then you get ingrained with using it, it really becomes hard to change, and then you're stuck with something that takes you much longer and is less tool-oriented and for the long run. So a lot of times it's much more worth your while to approach the learning curve of something like an audition up front, just so in the long run, if you're going to be producing week after week or every other week, you don't have to invest that extra time in a clunky tool.
Yeah, I really love Audition. I've used it for years. Audacity is like such a ubiquitous one because it's free, but it is just like the learning curve is so steep. And there are trainings and tutorials on YouTube, but it just takes a lot of time. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Well, I'll be available if you want to talk to me, and thank you so much for coming. This is like a really cool turnout.